We're live now. Hello and welcome to the live broadcast of Jinnah Institute's 3-day Ideas Conclave 2020 virtual conference. My name is Ammara Durrani. I'm Senior Fellow at the Jinnah Institute and I'm your host for this session entitled Realigning the Region. By region, we mean the geographic expanse covering south, west, and the larger Eurasian regions in Asia and its waters. 2 decades ago, foreign policy dialogues emanating from Pakistan would mainly be tied to South Asia and its fault lines, mostly dominated by the India Pakistan conflict. The 1990s IR literature spoke of a coming Asian century, led by economic powers of China and India, but we didn't have crystal clarity on what the specificities of an Asian century would be. Back then, we certainly couldn't predict that by the end of 2020, our region will be bracing for an end game of America's longest war in Afghanistan, with the specter of terrorism still uncurtailed, an unprecedented territorial tryst between China and India, the effects of a remarkably disruptive Trumpian age, and a global helplessness in the face of a pandemic for which the world, powered by artificial intelligence, has yet to find a cure. Yesterday, in Ideas Conclave's opening session, we watched President Jinnah Institute Senator Sharif Rahman converse with renowned world historian Peter Frankopan on a global reordering in the making. As we brace for a second pandemic year under the growing shadow of a new great power competition between the US and China, what are the major geopolitical, economic, and strategic shifts occurring in our region? To discuss these complex dimensions, my guests tonight are preeminent policy thinkers and practitioners who bring decades of first-hand experience in the foreign policy and security histories of our region. I'm deeply honored to be joined tonight by Ambassador Maliha Lodhi, who is author and former Pakistan ambassador to the UN, the US, and UK. Welcome, Ambassador Lodhi. Professor Dr. Marvin Weinbaum, who is Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. He is also Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a former U.S. government official. Welcome, Dr. Weinbaum, again to Jinnah Institute's webinar. Ambassador Janan Mosazai, who is Vice President of Heart of Asia Society and former Afghanistan Ambassador to Pakistan, China, and Mongolia. Welcome, Ambassador Mosazai. And last but not least, Siddharth Varadarajan, senior Indian journalist, founding editor of the spectacular The Wire, formerly with The Hindu. Siddharth is also a regular participant of Jinnah Institute's Chow Dialogue, which is the longest-running Track 2 dialogue between India and Pakistan. And I deem it pertinent to mention that as relations between our countries remain very tense at the moment, Siddharth, we really appreciate your commitment to dialogue for regional peace and stability. So warm welcome to all my esteemed guests. For our audience, we're live streaming on Jinnah Institute's YouTube and Twitter platforms, where you can also post your questions and comments. And we'll try our best to field some of your questions to our esteemed panelists. I want to start our conversation tonight with you, Ambassador Janan Mosazai, because Afghanistan is, for obvious reasons, the hottest, the most urgent, and the most pressing spot of instability in our region. It appears from this side that the peace process, which kick-started earlier this year, and the Doha talks have developed a fog of war of their own, not least because of the continuum of violence on ground in Afghanistan. It appears as if there's very little light at the end of the tunnel, and we don't even know how long that tunnel may be. Do you agree?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Ammara, for hosting this discussion, and I'm honored to be on the same panel as the other distinguished speakers, Professor Weinbaum, Ambassador Lodhi, and Siddharth from India. Violence has increased in Afghanistan, but I believe that that's probably not the most surprising issue. It is pretty common for warring parties to try to position themselves in a stronger military position, if you like, just as peace talks begin. And I think we can look at the significant spike in violence in Afghanistan, especially since February of this year. In that context, violence is getting unbearable. It is untenable. It has to come down, and that's why a ceasefire has to be the number one priority for Afghanistan's neighbors, for other regional stakeholders, and for the international community to support. There has been a call by the UN Secretary General. There has been a call by the European Union, which has been supported by many other countries, and obviously it's the number one priority for the Afghan people. But I believe that the bigger issue here and the bigger challenge is the deep divisions that still exist in the region. It is, I think, not impossible for the negotiating teams from the Afghan government and from the Taliban sitting in Doha to eventually come to an agreement. We heard just today, about half an hour ago, that the two negotiating teams have finally reached agreement on the rules of procedure, which does seem like a technical issue, but it is a major breakthrough if confirmed officially by both the Taliban and the Afghan government. And that will open the way for discussions and negotiations on the most vexing, the most difficult issues. And I believe that there is probably no issue to which the negotiating teams cannot find a solution. But if we continue to see the kind of behavior that we have been seeing from countries in the region, and here I would sadly include Pakistan as well, then any agreement that the Afghan parties reach could be jeopardized by continuing divisions and differences between and among various countries in the region. You mentioned India-Pakistan. We also have Iran, United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other combinations of countries in the region. So what is, I believe, essential now that the United States is disengaging from the region militarily, although it's not, it doesn't seem like it's going to disengage completely, even there, as President-elect Biden and his Secretary of State nominee, Tony Blinken, have indicated clearly that they want to maintain a follow-on counterterrorism presence in Afghanistan. But even as the US is disengaging from Afghanistan, it is that much more urgent for Afghanistan's neighbors to urgently engage in consultations, in sincere discussions on region-wide consensus and region-wide support for a peaceful, unified, stable, democratic Afghanistan. Because the possibility or the risk of violence spiraling out of control and turning into another regional proxy war is real. The risk is real, and the dangers to Afghanistan obviously would be huge. The consequences will be horrendous for the people of Afghanistan that have paid such a massive price over the past not just 20 years, but the past 40 years of conflict in the country. But it will not spare the region. It will not spare Pakistan. It will not spare Central Asia. It will not spare Iran. It will result in a massive wave of refugees flowing into neighboring countries. It will result in terrorism and violent extremism spreading even more widely in the region, and also to countries and societies farther afield. I think it would be absolutely dangerous for any country in the region, Pakistan included, to try to dominate so-called post-America Afghanistan. Sadly, it seems that that might be still the case, still the thinking among certain circles in Pakistan. And if that's the case, that would be extremely dangerous. So I think it is probably the right moment to actually go from words to actions on the commitments that Afghanistan and Pakistan have made to each other during the visit last week by Prime Minister Imran Khan to Afghanistan, because Pakistan's role in the Afghan peace process is outsized. It is much more significant. It is much bigger than any other of Afghanistan's neighbors. You are on mute, I think.
Sorry. Quick follow-up question for you, Ambassador Mosazai. In the start of your comments, you clearly acknowledged the internal dynamic of the deep divisions within the Afghan polity. There's clearly a growing agency, a growing role of the Afghan segments to this dialogue. Now, how do you balance that in terms of importance and influence on the peace process vis-a-vis outside actors, this being an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned process? It appears that it's those deep divisions, and we're certainly seeing that because of the problems that we're watching with the talks. It's the divisions which seem to have emerged as the big stumbling block. How much agency do you ascribe to the domestic factors for the success of a peace process?
Well, I think it is obviously the an ultimate peace agreement would need to be negotiated by Afghans themselves, by the Taliban and the government negotiators. But in the absence of a region-wide consensus on the end state in Afghanistan, the kind of end state or the kind of future Afghanistan that the region would be happy with, that the region would accept and support, the absence of that vision, the absence of that consensus is actually making countries in the region default back on past practices. We have seen very clear examples of that in weapons continuing to flow into Afghanistan, in support provided to militants, in talk of reviving another resistance, so to speak, against a potential theoretical Taliban takeover following May 2021, when all American forces and foreign forces are scheduled to leave Afghanistan. So in the absence of that region-wide consensus, you will see groups inside Afghanistan also, whether it's the Taliban and also other maybe smaller factions, gravitating towards support from countries in the region, wherever they can get that support. But if there is a sincere discussion by all the countries in the region and an agreement that no one country will try to dominate Afghanistan post 2021, then that will at least create an opening for an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process, regionally supported, and then also internationally backed, that will hopefully result in a political solution, as opposed to another attempt at a military, or multiple versions of a military solution, which will just not work. It will plunge Afghanistan into a deeper war and also be dangerous to the region.
Thank you. Ambassador Lodhi, the optics of Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Kabul last week certainly were very positive, and the joint declaration that was issued by both Pakistan and Afghan governments at the end of that visit had very clear, tangible goals, tangible timelines. Now, in that context, do you agree with Ambassador Mosazai's assertion that outside actors have a more outsized role and there's ostensible domination of the peace process. What's your take?
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here at the Jinnah Institute's conclave. I will make an opening statement after I've answered your question, because I would like to frame the discussion in a wider context. Otherwise, we will be stuck in a very narrow discussion. But to respond to your question, I think the outsized role is of the Afghans themselves. Pakistan respects the sovereignty of Afghanistan, the independence of Afghanistan, and it has worked hard with the United States and the Afghan government and the Taliban to ensure that a Doha agreement was reached in the first place, and subsequently that an intra-Afghan dialogue began on the 12th of September in Doha. So I think, to say that Pakistan seeks to dominate, I think is a travesty of the facts. Pakistan has had long engagement, undoubtedly. It's our neighbor, but Pakistan has also absorbed the lessons of the past. So we hope and we look forward. This is a moment of great hope and opportunity. And I think Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Kabul itself indicates the commitment that Pakistan has to peace and stability in Afghanistan. But ultimately, as the talks in Doha get underway, and we hope that the agreement on the terms of reference will lead to substantive negotiations on core issues, it is up to the Afghans themselves. I mean, they must seize this moment. It is a historical moment, and it really is up to them. Regional support comes after the Afghans have decided. I think we can't put the cart before the horse. There has to be an agreement, and that agreement would readily and happily be endorsed. It's certainly by my country, and I'm sure by the other neighbors of Afghanistan as well. With that, may I turn now to what I would like to also state as an overview of our discussion. So I think, first of all, I believe the regional situation has to be seen in the context of the global environment, which is where you started, and how the bigger geopolitical picture can affect the regional state of play. And for this reason, I think, let me identify three features of the global environment which are noteworthy for the purposes of this discussion. Of course, there are many other characteristics of the global landscape, but these are three key features that can affect regional, alignments or the lack of alignments. First of all, I think the unsettled phase the world is passing through, not because of COVID alone, but also because of the fact that the international system is in flux. There are fundamental power shifts that are underway. In fact, they have been in progress for some time, with power shifting from the West to the rest. Multilateralism has been under unprecedented stress, and a rules-based international order has been fraying increasingly under the weight of so-called strongmen who have been acting unilaterally and trying to rewrite the rules of the game. The second feature, of course, is something that Ambassador Janan also mentioned, which is the advent of a Biden administration in the United States. And of course, Pakistan, along with, I think, much of the world, welcomes this. And the question about what kind of a departure this administration, the incoming administration, is likely to make in the conduct of US foreign policy. We know, for example, that it will want to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, but its topmost priority clearly would be relations with China, and it is as yet unclear if the substance of the Biden administration's stance on China will be different beyond being less abrasive in form and rhetoric. So I think these are some of the dynamics we'll have to watch. The return or the commitment to returning to multilateralism, already voiced by the incoming administration's new picks for its foreign policy team, again, is a very welcome development, but we need to see how this plays out. Three, and that's a subset of the second, is of course, and I won't deal with this in any detail, we can discuss this later, is how the Sino-US standoff, the unprecedented tensions will affect regional dynamics. I think President Xi's message to President-elect Biden only yesterday, again, we hope that this is a harbinger of a more positive development in their relationship, because This is the most consequential relationship, bilateral relationship of the 21st century between China and America. And it has global impact. So how it will run, whether it'll be rocky or it'll be smooth, is obviously going to have an impact. With that, let me turn to the regional situation. Now, from Pakistan's perspective, the situation on its western border, that is vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Iran, we hope that this Iranian nuclear deal is revived. We think that will also be a very positive development for the region and for the world. But on our western border, as I said before, the Afghan peace process now underway represents or presents a hopeful opportunity for peace and stability. And it holds promise for what we've all been dreaming of, because it's only a dream so far, which is greater regional connectivity. But on our eastern frontier, sadly, the state of play is grim and volatile, with the dialogue suspended between India and Pakistan, and the situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir grave, a year after India's illegal action in annexing the state. So, in terms of the subject of this session, which I thought is rather ambitious, a realignment of forces is underway on the Afghan side. But on the other front, the situation is in a state of dangerous deadlock. So let us look briefly at the regional glass that is half full, the situation in Afghanistan. The Doha Agreement, as Ambassador Janan also said, has opened up the prospect of a negotiated end to a war that has gone on for much too long, 20 years, if not longer. Pakistan has, from the start of the war, and I happen to be my country's ambassador in Washington at the time of 9/11, from the very start of the war, we maintained that there is no military solution to this conflict. And therefore, we have welcomed the agreement at Doha, and as I said before, contributed in whatever way we could to the developments that have led to this. And we hope that the start of the intra-Afghan talks on more substantive issues will lead to a ceasefire, if not a full ceasefire, but at least a humanitarian ceasefire in the interim until all issues are resolved. Now, the talks have seemed to have concluded agreement on the TORs, but obviously the tougher negotiations lie ahead. Now, the path to an agreement is not going to be easy. It never is anywhere in the world after a bitter, prolonged, and bloody conflict. But I think the two Afghan sides are aware of the opportunity that they have and of the Afghan people's yearning and desperation for peace. So hopefully the parties know the stakes and therefore will be able to seize the moment. The main sticking points in these talks are expected to be obviously a ceasefire and some form of transition arrangement, the first being a priority for Kabul, and the latter, the interim arrangement for the Taliban. The positions are very far apart, but we hope that the two sides are able to hammer out some kind of an agreement. Now, I'll just spend a minute or two on the announcement by the United States, the Pentagon announcement of withdrawing more troops, accelerating its pullout ahead of schedule. In a way, this is President Donald Trump's last Afghan act. And this has raised the question whether this can lead to a disorderly exit or it will have only marginal impact. Now, my own view, and I believe this is also the view of Pakistani officials, is that it is unlikely to substantially affect the situation. Because in any case, the US troop presence was coming down, and nobody was really surprised by this announcement because President Trump had been saying this for several months. And in any case, the United States will retain its air power. And of course, we have the coalition forces, the other countries who have about 12,000 or so troops who are there to assist and advise the Afghan forces. So I think the important question is going to be the international community's engagement. And I think what has been hopeful has been the recent pledging session in Geneva for Afghanistan, which has seen $12 billion being pledged over the next 4 years. And I think this is going to be the key. The international community, their leverage is going to rest on financial assistance. It is not going to rest any more than it ever did on coercive pressure. The military option has been exhausted, that's pretty clear. So we are going to see perhaps economics or economic leverage as the way in which the international community is able to persuade the two parties to, make progress in their negotiations. So, I mean, there's great opportunity there, but there's also a danger. And the danger is exactly what Ambassador Janan talked about, which is, if there is lack of an agreement, if the two parties are unable to come to a negotiated settlement, then what will happen? So I will leave it there, but let me turn very quickly to relations with India, and then I'll conclude very, very, very briefly.
I want to, Ambassador Lodhi, I want to bring India in our subsequent round of discussions. If I could quickly move to Dr. Weinbaum to cover a few points on Afghanistan, and then I want to have a larger conversation on India and the region. Dr. Weinbaum, Ambassador Lodhi, in her brilliant broad brushstrokes, I think two things stand out in her pertinent observations. And I believe both of them are deeply connected to the US as the preeminent superpower, despite its, reduced approach towards things. One is the unsettled nature of the international system. And by an extension, the current transition phase in the US, as Ambassador Lodhi pointed out. And the other is, while on Pakistan's Western Front, things are moving in some direction, there's a dangerous deadlock on the Eastern Front between India, Pakistan, and of course, there's a China dimension now after Ladakh. Now, the US transition post-elections, how will that impact the Afghan process to begin with? Is the new Biden administration going to take 100% ownership of the Trump administration's approach towards the peace process, or are you going to do you foresee significant departures in approach and strategy?
Well, let me say that, and again, as the others have indicated, it's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel and this opportunity to express our views on this topic. I tend to put far more emphasis here on what the Afghans do for themselves. In this sense, I may have to disagree with Ambassador Janan on that score. All too often, countries, when they find themselves in difficulty, find it very easy to lay all the blame on the others. And the most unfortunate part of that is that it absolves them from responsibility from what they themselves have been responsible for. As I see it now, this process, and we'll come to the US on this because the US has played an instrumental role here in trying to get this peace process on track. And it has received, let me say, it has received regional support. I believe there's been a surprising degree of consensus here around the point that a Taliban restoration of an emirate would not be in anyone's interest in the region. I think there's also a feeling broadly in the region and elsewhere that a Taliban presence in a partnership, in a coalition, would be very much in order to have Afghanistan become a stable country in the future. I say that this is Pakistan, this is Afghan owned at this point, very much so. And as such, we have to look at why this process has gone so slowly. After all, the path forward was laid in the 29th of February agreement between the US and the Taliban. It was an agreement which should have led immediately to serious negotiations. Instead, what we have witnessed, and I think this has been very revealing, what we have witnessed is the great difficulty here in arranging any kind of future for Afghanistan where the contesting parties here have a similar vision of what Afghanistan should be. So what I'm getting at, and point that I've made endlessly, I guess, over the last months and longer has been that what really is at the heart of the difficulty and why outside players, be they the region or the United States, have at this point a more limited role. I think they had a instrumental role in getting this process underway. But now it is very much in the lap of the Afghans themselves. And I don't think that you can ignore this. And that gap that exists, an existential gap, I believe, between the Taliban and the Kabul government, one representing here a vision of Afghanistan, which is essentially a Sharia state, and what follows from that. And the other is the preservation of a, however flawed, democratic constitutional regime in Afghanistan. I don't believe you can bridge these two differences. International conflicts have often involved disputes which are not negotiable as long as the parties hold to their core values. They're not negotiable. They almost always end in one side winning or dictating a peaceful outcome, and the other side losing. And I'm afraid that unless we see Afghanistan in this framework, that we're really we have expectations about what will follow now, which just cannot be realized. So I just want to say that as far as what role the international community could play, or the regional here, and I think that really the plans here, which are out there for regional connectivity, are really quite inspiring. But what it comes down to is that regional alliances and the potential here for economic growth and for development of this region, which is the least integrated region in the world. The potential here really rests on what happens in Afghanistan. As long as Afghanistan is not stable, as long as it is not at peace, as long as it is so consumed by its own problems right now and finding just simply this solution, nothing can go forward. Everything is on hold. These regional countries are absolutely important, that they not be spoilers. And at the moment, I don't see the region as being a spoiler. It has been in the past. Certainly Pakistan has been times in the past. I don't see that as being the critical element here at all. Right now, without these countries, there can be no peaceful, prosperous Afghanistan without it being in a regional context. The region is absolutely critical here for the success of Afghanistan. Certainly, if there were a peace agreement, for that to be sustained. But at this point, what I'm trying to stress is that the region and outside players have really pretty much done about everything they can do. At this juncture, it is up to the Afghans themselves. And what I'm sadly concluding here is that I see the prospects here as being rather limited. Let me say, yes, I think that if they have reached some kind of, and I say if, because we've so often in the past had one side saying, well, we've finally resolved this, only to have, and it's usually the Taliban saying, not so fast. If there is an agreement, what saddens me here is because as I watch this process since February, where we finally have gotten the Taliban to expose what its real intentions are. We've been, I think this has been the value of these negotiations, because they bring out what is essentially motivating them, and we have a far better idea of the potentials here. But as long as I've lost my thought here for a moment, but it's really going to be, as I say, up to them here to go forward here with a solution. The outside players cannot dictate, they cannot greatly influence the outcome at this point. Just word about the U.S. in this. The U.S.'s role, I believe, is a diminishing one. As we extricate ourselves, and we may very well, under a Biden administration, be willing to argue for a presence here, a counterterrorist force presence. But if we argue very strenuously from that, I would suggest that will probably eliminate the possibility here of a agreement in Doha or anywhere else. Because the one thing that the Taliban have insisted upon all along has been the removal of foreign forces. Why? Because with the removal of foreign forces, it has two paths to success as it sees it, which I do believe is an emirate. And I don't really think that they have ever denied that. They've certainly avoided making it a bedrock part of their demands. But that's the point. Yes, let me come back to just that point about the negotiations where I lost my thought. Throughout this process, what we have seen is that it has been the Kabul government that has made all the concessions. The Taliban, through this, have not in any way yielded, and they have pretty much come to the conclusion that if we stand tight on our position, the others will come around. And so I would not be at all surprised if there is an agreement now. It's because finally now the Taliban have gotten the government to say, yes, it's going to be the agreement reached on the 29th of February. They may try to cover this over, give a good face to it, but that's the reality. The U.S., coming back to that point, I'll conclude with this, the U.S. now, in any sense here, will always be a player, but it's time when it could be in a position here to really, I think, exert great influence. I think is passing. The countries in the region, China, Russia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran here are going to be far more important now. The United States will try, I think, to maintain, it's in its interest to try to maintain some influence in the region. But that cannot, I think, be achieved with what has now been a situation where the outgoing administration has boxed in the new administration. It has precluded it from some of the options that might have been there. So at a minimum, what we will see is a toehold that the United States will maintain. And I don't think that that's tenable if the situation becomes militarily more difficult over the coming months. So let me stop on that.
So, right. Thank you, Dr. Weinbaum. We'll talk at length about U.S.'s shifting priorities and evolving role. But I want to come to Siddharth. Siddharth, I think I agree with Dr. Weinbaum that more and more the role of regional actors, regional players is going to be much more significant on the Afghan question. India has invested significantly in Afghanistan since 9/11. I note with pertinence Dr. Weinbaum's observation that so far the regional role since the start of the peace process has been positive, regardless of conversation or talks about the role of spoiler. India has found itself in somewhat of a challenging situation post-February. Do you agree? What are India's options now vis-a-vis Afghanistan? Do you see India going along with this positive regional momentum that Dr. Weinbaum has alluded to?
Ammara, I think India, right from the defeat of the Taliban regime, has taken the view that its own role, or the most significant contribution it can make to the restoration of peace and stability in Afghanistan, is by extending economic and development assistance. And India is still a poor country, but has extended something like $2 billion in the past. And I think the government has announced a commitment of, I believe the figure is $3 billion in a host of development projects to be embarked upon over the next few years. So that's the primary role that India sees for itself. It, of course, strongly backs the Kabul government, the Afghan government. In the past, India has had rather deep reservations about the prospects for dialogue with the Taliban and the prospects for that kind of negotiated solution, especially if it comes along with a kind of artificially hastened timeline for the withdrawal of US forces. But despite its reservation and despite its own opposition to the Taliban, by and large, the government of India, successive governments of India, so the current Narendra Modi government and the earlier one under Manmohan Singh, have kind of gone along with what the Afghan government itself wants. So the Indian mantra, as it were, is an Afghan-led, Afghan-managed process. And India has full support for that. Now, in terms of practicalities, I think the obstacles which have emerged are, of the kind that India itself cannot really do much about. The Taliban's own attitude leaves a lot to be desired. And, despite the Afghan government going out of its way repeatedly to try to push the envelope towards a negotiated settlement, the fact is that most of the setbacks in the process have been driven by the Taliban's own approach. And probably the Taliban is doing that because it felt encouraged by the prospect of a hasty US withdrawal, regardless of outcome, regardless of what happens at the negotiating table. And they were perhaps simply playing for time. What a Biden administration will do, I think, is no matter how much of a withdrawal Trump commits the incoming administration to in his last few weeks in office, my sense is that President Biden will not want to cut and run in the same way that Trump's mindset has been. And what impact that will have on the Taliban and on negotiations remains to be seen. But the Indian role really, I think, still is one of trying to do the most it can as far as development projects are concerned. There is an element, the so-called Pakistan-India rivalry in Afghanistan, which is, which comes up as an obstacle, primarily by making it not easy for the Afghan government to, for India and Afghanistan to have proper transit corridors in place. Chabahar has been in the pipeline for ages. There is some talk of expediting it, and at the Geneva, conference, President Ghani, spoke positively about some developments on that front. But essentially, Pakistan's reluctance to allow normal transit between India and Afghanistan, has been a problem. It limits what the two countries can do. But I think the major lifting or the heavy lifting as far as the dialogue and peace process is concerned has to be handled by the Afghan parties themselves. And the best that India, Pakistan, other regional players can do, Iran, is to essentially offer a guarantee that that they will support whatever outcome emerges, provided the Afghan government is happy with that outcome. And I think support for the way the Afghan government, which in our eyes is the legitimate authority there, duly constituted on the basis of elections, on the basis of a constitution, on the basis of achievements that the people of Afghanistan have over the last decade and a half. I think that support for the government and support for what the government deems as acceptable is what India, Pakistan, all neighboring countries have to do. That's the way that I think India sees its role. Frankly, I know that when Dr. Abdullah was in Delhi recently, and even in other comments that have come from Afghan ministers, they would like to see some positive engagement between India and the Taliban. That's unlikely to happen for a number of reasons that have to do with Indian domestic politics. But I'm personally not even very convinced about the utility of what an India-Taliban dialogue would produce and how that would necessarily speed things up on the Afghan domestic front. But I must say that if there is a disconnect between the Afghan government's attitude and New Delhi's attitude, it is this, that New Delhi still cannot reconcile itself to the idea that the Taliban are some kind of legitimate player. Having said that, the government of India is still firmly committed, and I think sincerely so, to supporting whatever deal emerges from those negotiations, provided the Afghan government is fully comfortable with that outcome.
Thank you, Siddharth. Ambassador Lodhi, Siddharth has referred to Pakistan's reservations and restraint on the India-Afghanistan transit trade, which is a reality. And Pakistan has been very vocal about its own concerns vis-a-vis the role of spoilers towards the peace process. What is at stake for Pakistan here? Despite the obvious threats, what are the key stakes for Pakistan? What are some of the key dividends that we ought to be deriving out of this peace process, keeping a big picture in mind, especially vis-a-vis India?
Well, look, I think what we have not discussed, and perhaps it's time to move in that direction, is the crisis in relations between Pakistan and India right now, a crisis that was triggered by India's action last August to annex illegally the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and the triggering of several crises as a consequence. A humanitarian crisis in occupied Kashmir, a crisis in the bilateral relationship, a crisis in human rights in Kashmir. So I think that is the context in which you have to pose your question. Transit trade then becomes somewhat of a footnote in this bigger picture. And the big picture is that somehow a way has to be found to return to dialogue between Pakistan and India. But the question is, dialogue on what terms? At the moment, as you know, the only diplomatic engagement that takes place between Pakistan and India is through making démarches. There aren't even high commissioners in the two countries, for example. But other than that, I think, only very recently, as you know, Pakistan has presented a dossier of Indian involvement in subversive and terrorist activity in Pakistan to the United Nations, to the UN, and of course made some of this public. So, I don't want to get into the details of that, but the environment is very fraught. So the question is, what is possible in this very fraught environment, given the fact that India, now under Prime Minister Modi, rules out any conversation on Kashmir? You would recall that in the past many, many decades, almost 6.5 decades, Kashmir always figured in the negotiations or the talks that took place and the peace process that intermittently was in progress between the two countries. It was always on the agenda. It was always, there were always discussions. And of course, if you would recall, the structured dialogue between the two countries in the past had issues on the agenda which were of India's concern, and then there were issues of Pakistan's concern. Kashmir clearly was topmost amongst Pakistan's concern, while terrorism was topmost amongst India's concerns. But the fact that you had a structured dialogue on agenda items that both countries felt should be discussed was an important development, and it went on for many, many years, as you know. So the question, perhaps Siddharth could address that, or somebody else, or Marvin could, I don't know. Siddharth is in a better position. How can we revive a dialogue with India given the present situation, when India refuses to even talk about Kashmir? And yet you cannot wish Kashmir away. Kashmir is disputed territory. It is an international dispute. There are UN Security Council resolutions. I mean, I can run through the whole thing, but I don't need to, because these are very well-known facts. So, I mean, by pretending that this is some internal matter when it isn't, when it is an international dispute, and pretending that we don't want to talk about this anymore, where does that leave Pakistan? It leaves Pakistan in a position where we have to somehow manage our tensions with India, minus a dialogue. And a lack of resolution of Jammu and Kashmir means that, the dividends that you talk about, the peace dividends become a very, very remote possibility. How do you get peace? Until you get the most core, the most essential, the quintessential dispute between India and Pakistan resolved. So I think that's a question that Siddharth and others in India need to address themselves to. How do we get back to a dialogue that actually addresses the disputes and doesn't pretend that they don't exist?
Ambassador Lodhi, I think you're raising the point about the centrality of India-Pakistan conflict and its unresolved status. I can't help but notice that somehow Pakistan is very carefully managing that to prevent the extension of this conflict on the Afghanistan side. The optics, the narrative, the very committed support to the peace process, it is more geared towards ensuring the regional connectivity paradigm that Dr. Weinbaum has also pointed out. Seems to be a bifurcation, a very interesting bifurcation of conflicts that Pakistan is carefully balancing. It seems to be pursuing the cause of Kashmir structurally differently, while ensuring that that doesn't have an overhang or it doesn't overshadow Pakistan's efforts on Afghanistan. Do you agree? And is that the strategy, that duality of strategy, better for Pakistan?
I don't know how you framed this, frankly. It sort of is baffling for me. The two disputes are completely, not disputes, but the two issues are completely different. One involves the right of self-determination of a people who've been held hostage by an occupying power. So what we need to do on that front, and the management of our very tense and difficult relationship with India, is a separate issue. Our commitment to support peace and security in Afghanistan. Look, no country has suffered more than the Afghans themselves, than my country and your country, from the turmoil and the instability in Afghanistan. There's no doubt about it. So, the last thing Pakistan would want to see is continued strife and instability in Afghanistan. And therefore, I don't know about the bifurcation, but I think, we would like peace in all the region. Our basic, you talk about Pakistan's strategy. Our strategy has always been peace in our neighborhood. But the thing is that you can have a strategy, but it depends, it takes two to tango. So as I said, there's optimism on Pakistan's western frontier, but there is pessimism on Pakistan's eastern frontier. It does not look hopeful, the situation. And so the reason, so the two are, you have to, don't conflate the two. I would separate the two. Conflating it, I think, will lead to faulty conclusions.
Siddharth, you've raised two fingers.
I was going to say that I think the point that you were trying to make is that India and Pakistan have a constructive role to play in Afghanistan. And if they can't play that role through mutual agreement, shall we say, or dialogue, because that does seem very difficult to do right now, they should at least agree not to play spoiler or to allow their disputes on the India-Pakistan side to spill over onto Afghanistan, because were that to happen, it can do a lot of damage. So I think what you say is correct. I'm not sure that that's the Pakistani strategy, but I think that both India and Pakistan need to work towards that. On the wider issue, I know that you plan to move on to India, Pakistan, and the Kashmir issue, and so on. It's one of those bizarre coincidences that our discussion today is happening on the anniversary of 26/11, the terror attack on Mumbai. I bring it up not to score any points here, but simply to note that the India-Pakistan stalemate, or the collapse of the dialogue process, has a longer history than simply what happened with the reading down or the scrapping of Article 370 last year. No doubt what the Modi government did, to my mind, was something that is a violation of the Indian Constitution, and is something which is being opposed and challenged in the Indian Supreme Court, and I hope the Supreme Court finds time to do this quickly. But as far as India-Pakistan discussions on Kashmir are concerned, there hasn't been any substantive discussion on this for a good decade before what Modi did last year. And this is largely a product of the reality of terror groups operating in Pakistan with varying degrees of impunity. Sometimes there are activities that are at a very high level. Sometimes they wane a bit. In the case of the Bombay attacks, the Pakistan government at the time did well to investigate and to establish the domestic links of these characters, and cases were filed. But it's regrettable that those cases haven't progressed. I don't want to get into the ins and outs of this, because this is we've had many rounds of char fryer, never really managed to sort this out. But this is, I'm saying there is a history, and so what Ambassador Lodhi says is correct, that India-Pakistan relations are in a terrible situation right now, where it appears as if there's no prospect for dialogue. And certainly as far as the current government is concerned, it has taken the reality of the last decade, where India and Pakistan have not talked about Kashmir, and tried to turn it into a kind of de jure situation where it says, well, there's nothing to talk about.
But Siddharth, I want to categorically put this question on the table to you. Why is it not possible for India and Pakistan to talk? Despite August 5th, there's a very clear message from Pakistan side that dialogue needs to be resolved. Why can't we come to the table? What is stopping India?
I completely agree with you. I think it's essential that India and Pakistan come to the table. For that to happen, I think certain suspension of rhetoric is essential. I think it's not, it doesn't help for the Indian side to call the Pakistani Prime Minister or the Pakistani government names, or for the Pakistani Prime Minister to call the Indian Prime Minister names, in global forums. That's not constructive, quite frankly. I can understand the reaction in J&K to what the government of India did on August 5th, 2019. And this is a reaction which people in the rest of India, many people shared, that what was done was an undemocratic act. I wouldn't use the phrase annexation, which Ambassador Lodhi used, because the status in international law of Jammu and Kashmir today is exactly what it was when the Maharaja acceded to India back in the day. In the eyes of Pakistan, Article 370 never enjoyed any legitimacy anyway. Pakistan never deigned to accept the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir, for example, as any sort of representative of the people of J&K, right? So it seems a bit odd now for the reading down or the scrapping of 370 to send Pakistan into a kind of tailspin. So I think that, the situation, I think India and Pakistan do need to find a way to come back to having civil dialogue. And one way to do that, as we've noted in Chafra, is that at least cessation of hostile rhetoric is important, and to the extent to which you have violations of the ceasefire on the LC. This was one of the great accomplishments of Vajpayee and Musharraf back in the day. That ceasefire needs to be respected and made durable once again, because it's taking a terrible toll on the lives of people on either side. And those are the things that we need to work on. But as of now, speaking very frankly, I don't see much appetite as far as the domestic politics of India or Pakistan are concerned for having this kind of dialogue. So the best we can hope for is that neither side takes any steps that plunge us further down into the abyss. That's the best, as an analyst, that I can hope for today.
Thank you, Siddharth. Ambassador Lodhi, I know you've raised two fingers. I've got two specific questions for you from Pakistan's perspective. One, the new dossier of irrefutable evidence of terrorism by India and alleged terrorism by India and Pakistan, the new dossier, whether that puts Pakistan and India on a point of no return. Are we actually beyond a point of no return with that dossier? And then the second point, it's very interesting that as a response to the most recent heating up of the line of control, China issued last week a very carefully worded statement urging both countries to restrain. And this comes on the heels of China's face-off with India on Ladakh. Now, how do you see these dynamics impacting the India-Pakistan equation?
I'd like to quickly respond and then come to your questions as well, to something Siddharth said about Pakistan being in a tailspin because of the scrapping of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. It's not just that. It is the actions that India took, and those actions are very well known. The actions included a brutal lockdown. The actions included the gravest human rights violations, not that they didn't occur before, but in this phase, these were particularly egregious. This is not something that I'm saying. All you have to do is Google Amnesty International, the United Nations, the UN Secretary General himself, UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN repertoires. So, I mean, the human rights situation that was created in the wake of the scrapping of Article 370 and the actions India has continued to take in terms of disappearances, in terms of rape being used as an instrument of terror, and so on. To think that Pakistan would not respond on the basis of what was happening, and because Kashmir remains a disputed territory and remains an international dispute, we have to keep that in perspective. Now, for the question about dialogue, that's the question you asked, Ammara. Is that, yeah? Look, Pakistan has said we are ready, able, and willing to speak to the Indian government, provided India is able to speak to us on the disputes that divide us. We will not.
Does the dossier action?
Nothing is ruled out. Dialogue is never ruled out. But what are the terms of the dialogue? I think that's the issue. The terms cannot be, let's talk about everything except Kashmir. Let's talk about everything except, some of the allegations that we have made, and we have substantial proof of what we are saying. Let's discuss all of this. Now, in the past, these were discussed. Now, Siddharth is right in the sense that these discussions may not have led us anywhere. But I don't think anyone on this panel will ever say that diplomatic engagement should not take place because we've not had success in the past. Sometimes between two adversaries, it takes not just decades, it takes decades upon decades to come to some kind of an agreement. We were close to an agreement, for example, on Siachen. We've had agreements on confidence building measures in the past. Just to cite a few examples. Now, these were very modest gains, but I wouldn't throw these away. I would say that these were building blocks that we had to really then build on. That's why they're called building blocks. But to rule out dialogue on the basis that, well, it hasn't really yielded anything in the past, so we might as well not have it in the future, I think that is short-sighted of the Indian government, and it's dangerous of the Indian government. These are two nuclear neighbors. We have plenty to talk about. But as I said, the terms of the dialogue are key. Pakistan will not beg for dialogue. But Pakistan, as a responsible country, will say we need to discuss and, to the extent possible, resolve these issues, the outstanding issues that divide us.
And how do you see China's recent statement urging both
I don't
countries?
think there's anything unusual. China has always called for peaceful settlement. China has always called for de-escalation. So, China does not wish to see any conflict in the region with India or between India and Pakistan, and neither does Pakistan. So I think, one should not overread what the Chinese have said. One should not underread either. China has been a stabilizing factor in the region, in the world. And of course, as you know, Pakistan has a very robust relationship with China, which has been strengthened in recent years. So I will conclude by saying something that we may want to pick up because we have just about 20, 25 minutes left. I think the bigger picture, the picture where the United States, even under Biden, is likely to see India as a possible strategic counterweight to China. And the question whether India under Prime Minister Modi is prepared to play that role, I believe it is prepared to play that role. Pakistan, for its part, has made its strategic choice. And its relationship with China has been further cemented by Belt and Road Initiative and the fact that Pakistan is the pivot of this initiative through CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So, this four-way, again, I return to the subject of this session, which is alignments or realignments. I wouldn't say this is a realignment going on, but these are alignments which are going to impact how the regional play is going to take place. And I would also say, one more thing, because Marvin is here and he knows this extremely well. Pakistan seeks a very good relationship with the United States. It does not see its relations with China as some kind of a hindrance in its relationship with the United States. It doesn't want to. It wants to be able to have good relations with both. Now, that may be easier said than done, but it is a fact that we do not want to get into the crosshairs of this very tense relationship between the world's two global superpowers. But at the same time, naturally, our relationship with China will remain very, very meaningful and strong.
So I'm conscious of the fact that we're running out of time, and I do want to pick up the larger question, the larger realignment of the region that Ambassador Lodhi has also pointed out. Before I come to Dr. Weinbaum, I want to quickly ask Ambassador Mosazai, given your extensive experience of how Afghan government has been structuring a foreign policy paradigm for itself since 2001, and in this evolving overall new great power competition where we hope there are no new blocks, China or US blocks. We hope those fault lines don't really crystallize, but in the event of the peace process yielding clear dividends, in the event of stability in Afghanistan is really the heart of Asia. And a lot of these alignments, Afghanistan is the testing ground for these alignments, not least the competition between the US and China. How do you see Afghanistan's approach to this evolving new great power realignment in the region in the long run? And both the Taliban and the Kabul government have been categorical in expressing their foreign policy postures for the future. That of non alignment, that of ensuring that Afghan soil would not be used against attacks for its neighbors. What does that indicate in terms of Afghanistan's future foreign policy positioning?
I think that's a great question, and before I get to that question, can I just maybe briefly address the 2 points that were raised earlier by Professor Weinbaum and Ambassador Lodhi? I don't think that there is any disagreement, Professor Weinbaum, on the fact that the biggest responsibility falls on the shoulders of Afghans, the government and the Taliban. To me, that's a total given. The focus that I put on the region's role is because that's the topic of our discussion. And it's also a fact that Afghanistan's war is not a domestic war. It is actually a regional and an international war. That's why we have had forces from around 50 countries present, and that's why we have had, for the past 40 years, engagements and interferences by most of our neighbors. The second point is about what Ambassador Lodhi said. It's not a travesty to make the point that I made. The sad reality, unfortunately, is that we are still facing two Pakistans, really, when it comes to the Afghan peace process and Afghanistan-Pakistan relations. It is the people of Pakistan represented by their parliament, by their elected officials, the civilians, and it's the military. If you don't agree with that, read the book that your boss at the time when you were ambassador in Washington, President Musharraf, wrote, and he has been very open about the fact that about the things that Pakistan did in Afghanistan over those years, and sadly that has not really changed substantially. But I don't want to get into that, one-on-one discussion, and it's because it's as we say, it's a fact that we can't hide with two fingers. So the question before us, before Afghanistan, before the whole region, Pakistan included, is whether the region will come together now on an urgent basis and engage in the kind of necessary dialogue that will result in that consensus and that regional guarantee for Afghan peace, or will we just wait and see how things play out and witness an intensification of the war that will then draw in past interfering powers and also maybe even new players into an even bloodier regional war that will not spare Afghanistan's neighbors. On the foreign policy thinking and future trajectory of Afghanistan's foreign engagement, I think the vision that has been and the policy that has been outlined by President Ghani's government, which is multi-alignment, I think is a very reasonable, sensible, workable formula, because Afghanistan, as you pointed out, Ammara, correctly, as the heart of Asia, is a place, is a geography where powers that may not agree with each other or that may actually have deep disagreements, as we have just seen by the exchange between Ambassador Lodhi and Siddharth, could actually cooperate, because cooperation in Afghanistan, whether it's on the peace process, which is the immediate urgent priority, whether it's on regional connectivity and integration, whether it's cultural cooperation, whether it's cooperation on energy and regional transportation and fiber optic connectivity, is win-win. It is a win-win proposition for Afghanistan and for the region. Connectivity will bring Central Asia to Pakistan. It will bring Central Asia to Gwadar, to Karachi. It will facilitate that regional trade from South Asia to Central Asia, between China and West Asia, and it will benefit everyone concerned. So the multi-alignment policy that has been outlined, I believe, is something that the region can support, because it will not... Afghanistan, given the population that it has, given the landlocked position that it has in the region, it cannot be a threat to any of its neighbors. Certainly not to Pakistan, a nuclear-powered, a nuclear-armed regional power, as Ambassador Lodhi has correctly pointed out. It could actually become a source of strength for its immediate neighbors, and most immediately and most especially to Pakistan, because of the tremendous complementarities that exist between Afghanistan and Pakistan in terms of our shared history, in terms of our common culture, in terms of the deep and real affinity between the people of Afghanistan and the people of Pakistan, witnessed and evidenced by the extraordinarily positive and warm hospitality extended to millions of Afghan refugees by the people of Pakistan over some 40 years. So Pakistan will benefit from a peaceful Afghanistan, from a stable Afghanistan, but that requires Pakistan actually accepting and respecting Afghanistan as a sovereign, independent neighbor, not as a territory, as a geography.
Thank you, Ambassador Mosazai. Dr. Weinbaum, I think this is a pertinent question that Dr. Mosazai has raised for the larger region and the international community as a whole. Why must Afghanistan be a territory for contest? Why can't powers, whether they're regional powers like India and Pakistan or international powers like the US or China, why can't they collaborate or cooperate in Afghanistan? I mean, sure, the US is extricating itself from Afghanistan. In your view, it is on the retreat, although the Biden administration has articulated, has vowed to re-engage with the world. What would be the form of that re-engagement? Good collaboration and cooperation in Afghanistan in this region could be a manifestation of that re-engagement, because we hear the drum rolls of Indo-Pacific. We see a very different ball game evolving in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, very hostile. The confrontation between the US and China. And here we have an opportunity. How do you see the US repositioning itself in terms of looking at its options in the long run?
Well, I don't share the view that the international community and the regional community are at this point an obstacle. I see, as I mentioned, I believe that there is a commonality among them, that as long as Afghanistan remains an unstable country at war, so much of the aspirations of all of the actors really are on hold, as I mentioned. I believe that although this has not always been the case, certainly, and may very well may not be the case going forward, at the moment there is a stage here when they are working together. Now, as far as the United States is concerned and its role, I said before that they have a diminishing role. Certainly, there is evidence here that the United States is going to be really in a position to only influence one party, and that is the Kabul government. Its influence at this point of the Taliban is I don't see where that it is at all. The United States, even though it will have a diminished role, is not going to disengage from the region. I think this is very important. This is not the 1990s. In 1990, effectively, what the United States did was to walk away from the region, with dire consequences for Afghanistan and Pakistan too. This was not making a contribution at all. But this is not. In 1990, there was no concern here with global terrorism. There was not nuclear weapons on the subcontinent. In 1990, there was not the concern here with Iran's imminent ability to produce a nuclear weapon. China was playing a much more reticent role here than it is today. Russia certainly was as well. So this is a different environment. The United States, I believe, cannot afford and won't want to walk away from the region. What it can accomplish, though, is the question here. What it can accomplish if it does not have a presence in Afghanistan, which is more than just 2,500 troops and after April, perhaps none at all, because the international community will follow suit here as well. And as their commitment is reduced, this has an impact on the ability and the willingness of Afghans to be able to defend themselves. So I just don't see the United States as not being a player, but I do question here about the effectiveness of what it might conceivably hope to accomplish.
But Dr. Weinbaum, beyond Afghanistan, beyond the troop pullout, as you say, the U.S. Intends to remain engaged. What would be the form and character of this engagement? So, for instance, do you expect the Biden administration to play a more proactive role in bringing Pakistan and India to the table in the long run, going beyond President Trump's rhetoric, for instance?
No, I think his rhetoric, President Trump's rhetoric here, fell so flat that I don't think anybody is going to repeat that. No, sadly, I don't think the United States has a role except in a situation of dire crisis. There, the United States, as we've seen in the past, the United States has an important role to play. So it's only in a crisis environment that I believe the United States can intrude itself in any way. But it's the feeling in Washington for the longest time has been that this is something that should be contained, the tension between the two countries, but we really cannot do anything to further it along. Let me just say one word about that, though. It's been 70 plus years, and Kashmir has been at the center of obviously what is the adversarial relationship between India and Pakistan. There have been 101 different solutions here. There have been countless efforts here to find some basis for negotiation on this. Again, if we look historically in a global context, taking the toughest issue and expecting that we'll solve that and everything else will fall into place just doesn't happen. To the extent that we have seen enmity, which has been decades long, see this enmity dissipate has always been because other factors came into play. It could have been called building trust, but it's the ability here to reach a point where both sides have more to lose by continuing the conflict than they do by letting it continue to fester. So I do think that the solution, if there is a solution here, ultimately lies on changing organically, and by that I mean slowly, changing the very character of the relationship. Often what has happened historically is that the way in which it happens, the catalyst here is usually they have a common enemy. And I think that there are some common enemies out there. I think the threat here now of climate change, the threat of terrorism, global terrorism, and its manifestation in the region are the kinds of issues that naturally can bring India and Pakistan together. And at some point in time, Kashmir is not resolved, but it doesn't matter as much anymore. Again, I'm drawing here from historical examples here, but certainly we can, I think, agree on the fact that whatever we've tried up to this point in trying to find that formula for Kashmir, it has not been found. And if anything, what Modi has done has only made that more difficult. I think we can agree on that.
I think we certainly can agree on the Kashmir situation, the Kashmir question becoming more difficult, but I wouldn't want to put it as becoming less, to matter less. I think because it has become more difficult, it matters even more. And we are in the last 5 minutes of our discussion, and I want to kind of put across a common question to all our participants. I think my big takeaway from tonight's discussion is that there is greater uh, there is greater onus now on regional players, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is India, whether it is Afghanistan, as opposed to what we've been used to, a world where international powers or actors like the US have pushed us or cajoled us or steered us. It appears as if we now have greater scope and space to take initiative of our own to resolve our problems, because the US, for that matter, is on the retreat, and it wants to be calculated about its engagement or disengagement with the region. Now, in this unsettled environment where there is lots of challenges but also lots of opportunities, what would be one major priority policy action that you foresee from your respective vantage points that could contribute to a greater regional collaboration and cooperation over the next 5 years? I'll ask you, Ambassador Lodhi, to respond first.
I think one has to be realistic. One has to be realistic about what is possible. First of all, I would agree with you that I think the role of, and I would agree with Marvin also, that the role of, let's say, external actors will diminish over time. I think the one thing that COVID-19 has shown us is that increasingly it's every country for itself. And I think some of this dynamic will continue because it is a dynamic that carries over from the pre-pandemic era as well. Increasingly, countries were looking to themselves and to their regions rather than to others, let's say. So I think that I would agree with, and I think that puts greater responsibility on regional actors. The region has to, in a way, take control of its own destiny. So with that, I would say, realistically speaking, I think the possibility of peace in Afghanistan presents a huge opportunity. Not only will the dividends of peace be available to the people of Afghanistan who have suffered through their long and dark night of tragedy for so many decades. They deserve peace above all. But it also opens up opportunities for better relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of course, the kind of connectivity that Ambassador Janan was talking about. So the door to regional connectivity will open up, but the big question mark will still remain India, because I think unless there is some degree of calm in relations between Pakistan and India, I cannot see regional connectivity involving, let's say, India. And I'm talking on the basis of realism. So I think for me, the most optimistic, the hopeful story is coming out of Afghanistan. And I think we should all be poised to take full advantage while respecting, as I keep repeating myself, Afghanistan's sovereignty and independence. This is, this is taken for granted. That is there. Thank you.
Thank you. Siddharth, should India continue to stay being a question mark?
I don't think India is a question mark. I think that, as I said in my introductory remarks, I think regional connectivity, particularly vis-a-vis Afghanistan, is a top priority for India. And being realistic about the fact that I don't see any immediate prospects for India and Pakistan to have political dialogue of the kind that both Ambassador Lodhi and I would like to see.
Siddharth, sorry, if
it's
regional connectivity is top priority for India and it is routed through Pakistan, wouldn't that be a motivating factor to come to the table?
Absolutely. No, that's what I'm saying. These are the ingredients. These are the small steps that could actually create a climate for India and Pakistan to find their way back. Another important step is, to restore bring the ambassadors back. Right now, each High Commission is headed by a Charge d'Affaires. It's important to have a fully empowered ambassador. So these are some of the small steps that need to be done. But I think the elephant in the room, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, is still the United States. And I think how the US manages its rivalries with China, with Iran, how the US manages Saudi Arabia as another regional player that we haven't spoken about. These are all potential, these can bring positive externalities if they're handled properly. But if those relations deteriorate, or if Biden does not address and reverse the horrible situation that Trump created vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis China, and so on, then the situation facing our Afghan friends is likely to get more complicated. So I think the US has to also do some of the heavy lifting here, even as the rest of the region expresses its willingness to join in.
One particular policy action that Afghanistan can do on its own?
Well, I think this is really a historic opportunity for peace in Afghanistan after 40 years of war. Again, also given some of the differences in context that Professor Weinbaum outlined based on his decades of experience, I agree with that completely. I think peace is possible. The region has changed, and I think one approach that the region can take, one concrete step that the region can take, is to actually revive and upgrade the Heart of Asia Istanbul process, which includes all of Afghanistan's neighbors, all the major regional powers, plus all the key international stakeholders, the US, the European Union, and other key stakeholders. And it actually not only focuses on peace in Afghanistan, key challenges and opportunities that the region faces, whether it's terrorism, whether it's connectivity, whether it's trade and transit, and all the rest. And that can become the framework for regional support and guarantee for Afghan peace, but also a framework for regional cooperation on all of the other key priorities that we are confronting.
Thank you. Dr. Weinbaum, you have the last word. The US's role remains critical, even if there is reluctance.
Let me say that I think that we all want to see a peaceful outcome of the current negotiations. But I think we have to make a distinction between what we would like to have happen, what we hope will happen, and what is realistically possible. I think at this point in time, and we'll let this process play out, but at this point, the region has a role to play as part of a plan B. Because if, as is conceivable, whether in a short period or sometime after the US is pulled out or after that, the process clearly has reached a dead end. And I think we had better be concerned about that, particularly because the result may not be a Taliban takeover at any point in time. It is a civil war that I think is a nightmare for all of us, for the entire region. This is the worst possible outcome for the entire region because they will get dragged into this. So I think that there is a need here for a plan B, and that is if it does not go well, or maybe in before that, we reach that stage, that the international community, but particularly here, the regional community, community, Heart of Asia group, certainly, say, look, we have such a stake in Afghanistan that we have to do everything within our reach here to assure its stability, its unity, and to work as best we can to provide for its prosperity. Then I believe the alliances that have been formed here can be positive, and I have in that sense a hope that the region may step up to what its potential is. It cannot dictate an outcome of negotiations, but it can certainly and is critical as a backstop for what may inevitably be a breakdown in those negotiations.
Thank you, Dr. Weinbaum. Pertinent point about the region needing to have its own plan B. And I think that ties very well with Ambassador Lodhi's earlier comment about Asia and the region needing to chart its own destiny. And I think this being the Asian century, this is a historic opportunity. While being realistic, I think all speakers have acknowledged little windows for dialogue, for collaboration as Plan B, and to steer the process and the opportunities forward. This brings us to the closure of our session. I want to thank all our esteemed panelists, Ambassador Lodhi, Ambassador Mosazai, Dr. Weinbaum, Siddharth, for your valuable time. And Jinnah Institute is committed to exploring ideas, the realm of ideas in difficult circumstances, and to look for opportunities that can promote those ideas for regional stability and peace. And we hope to continue our conversations with all of you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ammara.
Thank you.
Thanks.